All right, let's get this started. This is something that I actually want to talk about. It's going to be a trial run for the second type of video that I'm hoping to record, which is going to be videos more about the thought of writing and narrative. So for a trial run, I can think of nothing more near and dear to my heart than the complexity does not equal depth argument that I have talked about and argued about time and time again. And I think it's really important because it's such a common misconception among all spheres of art. And before we really get into this, I want to be clear that the thesis of the statement is that complexity does not equal depth. Not complexity is antithetical to depth or complexity bad. Just that the misconception of these two things is problematic and potentially damaging to the overall way in which we view art and the way in which we limit ourselves by our thinking. So to get into this, I'm going to start with other art forms and then kind of bank into writing, because the reason that this really came up for me recently was a friend sent me a song, and with it was attached a comment on the song about how this song in question is a masterpiece and should be appreciated for the number of time signature shifts that go on through the song. Now, my favorite genre of music, hands down, the thing I listen to all the time, 90% of the time, is progressive death metal, usually in the style of like Opeth. So I'm not a total stranger to the concept of time signatures, abstract time signatures, or time signature shifts within a particular song. So that's not the issue here. Or rather, I should say, the thing is, I'm kind of a potato brain when it comes to music. So I'm not very good at actually hearing shifts in time signature, but I also have not studied a lot of music theory. And so maybe with the amount of practice, I could develop an ear for that. But that's not the point. The point is, as a fan of progressive death metal, I have heard things that have crazy time signatures, and people praise them and for the technical prowess at work, and I just find them awful to listen to. It just sounds like noise to me. And then there have been things that are more simplistic that I find more enjoyable to listen to, and then there are things that are complicated that I enjoy listening to. The point being that I don't find the shifting time signatures to be necessarily required for my appreciation of the song. And this was exactly what my friend's take on this individual song was yes, it does adapt a lot of time signatures, and yes, it is a very complex song, but it's not necessarily a very deep song. In fact, outside of the shifting repetition, my personal take on the song in question was that it was pretty repetitive, and I didn't particularly enjoy it. I wasn't even able to finish it. So there's an example in music, but I also see this a lot in like video games and game development, where a lot of people like to think that the more options you give a player, the more depth there is to the game and to the system. And the fact of the matter is, this just isn't the case. It's demonstrably not the case, because you can look at, let's say, something like Overwatch or any hero shooter, and then you look at something like Counter-Strike, which Counter-Strike has persisted, probably like one of the only games to have persisted almost unchanged. I mean, granted, like on a meta level, there are huge differences between Counter-Strike 2 and the original Counter-Strike that came out in like 2000 something. Give me a quick second here and I can look it up. It's typing. Don't worry about it. 2000. Okay. 25 years. So in terms of like the closest analogy to a proper sport you can have in video games being primarily the same thing, like there's been engine changes and things like that, but being more or less the same game across 25 years, Counter-Strike is it. And part of that is due to the game being fairly simple. Now, granted, it's not ultra simple in the case of something like your Quake Instajib, where all you do is move and shoot. That's primarily what everything comes down to, is your movement, your shooting, and your map knowledge. Counter-Strike has a bit more to it than that, but compared to something like a hero shooter, where you have 27 different characters, each with 3 different abilities, put into a 6v6 game where you need to understand all the abilities and everything that's going on. It's more complex. It's infinitely more complex, but the amount of depth, the simplicity of Counter-Strike offers far eclipses that of something like a hero shooter or Overwatch, because everybody has a simple kit in Counter-Strike, but that kit is specifically designed so that every tool, every piece has its place. And when you know what everybody has and what every specific tool is, then that means that you really have to take advantage of different aspects of the game and really understand the nuance elements, and how you effectively utilize those tools becomes all the more important. I'm not explaining that very well, but trust me when I say that from the simplicity breeds a kind of depth, because the fact of the matter is there are more options available to you, more viable options, I should say, in a game of Counter-Strike at any given moment than necessarily in a game of Overwatch at any given moment. Now, to keep my whole not all complexity and depth is the same, and complexity is not necessarily antithetical to depth. On the one hand, you've got a game like Counter-Strike. On the other hand, you've got a game like Dota or any MOBA that is extremely complex, and that is the draw to it, and people will argue till the end of time which is better, which is more competitive, blah, 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 whatever. They both have their place, and that's the point I'm trying to make here, is that one is not inherently better than the other due to its inclusion of complexity, because there are times when complexity can create depth, but there are also times when complexity is antithetical and actually limits the amount of depth that something can have. And you even see this in the fact that to this day people still play chess. And that's huge, because when you think about it, I still have people tell me that chess is so complicated and they can't understand it. This is insanity, because any single video game that comes out these days is, like, no hyperbole, 100 times more complicated than chess. Chess has, like, 6 specific movements of pieces, I guess like 7, some oddities in there. I haven't actually done the math, so I'm just winging it. And then a few rules on weird things like castling and things like that. But otherwise, chess is actually an extremely simple game, especially compared to every single video game that has come out. And yet it has continued to be a game that has been played over and over and over again, because much like with Counter-Strike, those simple tools and the universal rules allows actually for so many more options. And you can take this a step further with Go, the board game Go, which is not very well known, where, again, there aren't even multiple types of pieces. There's only the one piece, and yet Go is a game with infinitely more depth than even chess. We're talking like Marianas Trench levels of head-crushing depth, and yet it is so utterly simple because you only have the one piece. And through that simplicity arises so many options and approaches, and not just approaches, but viable approaches in play, that it actually reaches levels that chess can't. So with that in mind, let's transition a bit into writing, because I think when it comes to complexity in writing, for the most part, what I'm referring to is prose. But there is a bit in terms of story structure, because like a lot of people like to talk about 3-act structure, and you know what? Let's just run with this thread here for a bit. 3-act structure is the most common way that a lot of people think of a story. Or there you can go back to like Freytag's Pyramid, or there are lots of these sort of the hero's journey is another one. These guidelines, these outlines for how to write stories. But the thing is, these outlines are just that. They're outlines. And much like 4/4 and time signature, or a lot of other things, certain rules in games and whatever, the fact of the matter is, not all stories have to follow these structures in order to be successful stories. And in fact, many successful stories don't follow these structures. There are numerous plays dating back that are just 2 acts, or I think most of Shakespeare's are 5-act plays. So not everything has to follow a pattern. But just because something breaks away from the pattern doesn't necessarily make it a masterpiece unto itself, nor does it mean that something that follows the pattern is any less of a masterpiece than something that doesn't. The pattern is just a pattern. It is a recognized, like, especially, here's the thing with, like, Joseph Campbell's Heroes with 1,000 Faces. What he did was research a bunch of stories and compile their commonalities. So it wasn't something that people were writing to. Like, obviously, a lot of these old myths weren't written to a standard. They didn't look at this and then write it. It's just a lot of common traits that tend to be successful. And when you really think about it, that's what a lot of writing advice, a lot of any artistic advice is, because you can take, your story into a writing classroom, have it critiqued, and get 20 different opinions that have 20 different ideas for what would make this work better. But because it's art, there is no idea of better. So functionally, it's just ideas for what would make it, in their eyes, more readable, or maybe bring out elements that might, to them, make it more presentable. Like, functionally, it is not an objective trait. So what they're trying to help you accomplish in the review, or, review as in literally reviewing your work, is usually how to bring it more in line with what is traditionally expected. This is like 9 out of 10 times what's going on. And they're not bad for that. In fact, 90% of the time, I'd even go so far as to say 99% of the time, it's good advice. And even, it's usually what the story needs. It's fine, no problem with that. But there are these 1% of events that's not what the story calls for, and it takes an author to stand up and say that, I believe in my vision, and sometimes it pans out, and a lot of the times it doesn't. And that's not to say that you shouldn't try, just that, you have to keep in mind. But even for the ones who said, this is my vision, I'm sticking to it, I'm going to work, and then it goes on to be a success, again, it is not necessarily better inherently for having gone against the mold. So shifting from that into prose, which is where I really like to talk about this this sort of topic, because I recently, for the first review that I did, talked about The Morning Star, and there I talked about the simplicity of the prose and how that simplicity enabled you to focus on the themes. And that's pretty important. Now, I want to give a bit of backstory here, because actually I used to be on the other side of this discussion where I really valued prose. And this is because in college, when I really got back into reading, I got back into reading with these big fantasy books, and I loved big fantasy books with a lot of characters, a lot of settings, a lot of complexity, stuff like The Wheel of Time, stuff like Game of Thrones, and Malazan, and Brandon Sanderson, even though there were only 2 books at the time, and Stormlight. These were the kinds of things that I was really into. But with it, even then, I preferred the prose of, like, George R.R. Martin or Robert Jordan, where they had a distinct voice that captured, in my mind, a sort of high fantasy feeling and evoked that. Whereas when I read something, and it was really Michael Sullivan was the author with his, I can't even remember the name, the Rhyrea Chronicles, I believe is what it was called, books, where I first encountered a very, very simplistic prose that I didn't even think about it at all. And later on, when I was listening or reading something about his process in writing, I discovered that this was a deliberate choice on his part to make a prose which, as you read it, fades into your mind. You don't even see it. It's almost like it exists just to create a projector inside your brain which is playing a movie. And to me, that was almost heretical, because so much of fantasy and so much of the identity of fantasy is wrapped in this sort of high adventure, coming to another world, going, on a grand journey, and the prose is meant to evoke that medieval feeling of a time when the world wasn't as mapped out, wasn't as known, where science didn't rule everything, and there was still more mystery than there is fact, which I understand nowadays is still true, but that's a matter for another time. Just, it's the feeling I'm talking about, not necessarily the reality. So, but what was doubly baffling was the discovery that for Michael Sullivan, crafting this prose is actually a lot of work. In fact, he goes so far as to read the entire novel of an entire draft aloud before making the final edits, which is insane to me. A lot of work, but something I hope to do some today. I don't know if I'll ever get quite to that point, because that's just crazy. But the point being, there is a skill set associated with crafting uninvasive prose. And this is where I feel you kind of end up separating writers into, I don't like binaries, but for the sake of example, let's go with a binary. On the one hand, in terms of fantasy, you have your George R. R. Martins, your Robert Jordans, you're very evocative. Purple for prose is derogatory, but in terms of just using rapid extremes for the sake of example, mind you, these aren't literally, you don't take it verbatim, it's just for the sake of example, your purple flowery prose people on that side. And then on the other side, you've got your Sullivans. You're just extremely simple prose. I think that both actually accomplish things well, and where I actually really have a problem are you kind of authors who kind of are in the middle, where they don't quite pull it off and it ends up being distracting. And this is where you kind of get Brandon Sanderson is often criticized for his prose. It's simple, it gets the job done, but every once in a while there's just something that really stands out to you, or something that's just phrased in kind of an odd way. And this isn't to dunk on Sanderson, it's just to give an example. There are dozens more, hundreds more that are far worse. It's a big name. So ultimately, I don't read fantasy anymore. Anyway, no disrespect to fantasy, it's not what I choose to spend my time reading, but it's a really, really good demonstration of this. So transitioning into literature is where I find that it really actually becomes beneficial to have a simpler voice depending on the theme or book that you're trying to convey. I have mentioned in the last video that Haruki Murakami is my favorite novelist, and this continues to be true to this day. And I think that part of what he accomplishes with his work is to keep the work grounded in such a way that the idiosyncrasies of it aren't too overwhelming to your average reader. And this is what lets him strike that balance between accessibility and while still offering an insane amount of depth. So what I mean by that is, if you give most people a novel by Nabokov, and let's just be honest, he's kind of when you talk about good prose, his name will always come up, and understandably so. His prose is very excellent, and I will never deny that. The man was a master wordsmith and compositionist with his sentences. Just brilliant, fantastic at that. But you give most people Nabokov, and I'm talking about your layman, most average, non-readers, and either one of two things happens. They get pulled in by the language, or it absolutely turns them off, and they don't even finish it. They just shut it. Nope, I'm out. Whereas I think with someone like Murakami, both camps are going to keep on reading based on the content, less so than the language. It's not going to provide that barrier to people getting invested in the book, and that's great for dropping the barrier of entry for a lot of literature. But it also potentially, and this is where word choice and word usage comes into play, can end up offering a lot of free space in terms of interpretation and expression. And in the previous video, I talked about how there's a difference between Japanese style paintings and Western style paintings, as Murakami himself commented in Killing Commendatore, where a Japanese style painting has a lot of white, a lot of blank space, and it uses that empty space to evoke feelings, whereas a Western painting is a lot more detailed, a lot more full, uses the whole canvas. And it's not a question of, this is me moving on into my own takes, it's not a question of one being better than the other. They're just two very different things. And I think that the Japanese style painting, that approach of blank space, is often very underappreciated because it's not as immediately it's not as easily appreciable. It's not as immediately appreciable. You can't just look at it and go, wow, I get it, or wow, the technique is crazy. You kind of look at it and you go, oh, that's neat, that's interesting, and then you kind of stare at it a bit longer, and it starts to make you feel things, and it's kind of a steady process, a slow build up, which can still happen in the other ones. I just don't think it has that same wow factor right out the gate, that really eye-catching thing. And I think it's the same for like Murakami's prose, or I was reviewing The Morning Star, so Carl of Knausgaard also similarly, I believe, utilizes this to great effect, where the simplicity of the prose leaves a lot for the reader to fill in the blanks. You know, you can spend a paragraph describing a scene, like let's say a character drinking a beer. You could spend an entire paragraph where you describe the sweat on his forehead, the feeling of the beer in his hand, fresh out of the freezer, the condensation as it runs down his fingers, just that ice coldness that his parched throat is just dying to get it in there. And when he finally puts it to his lips, it's like tantalizing on his dry, cracked lips, the smooth bottle, and he tips it back and he just feels the liquid as it rushes forward towards the mouth of the bottle. And then there it is, it's on the tip of his tongue, just this refreshing, bitter taste as it washes down his throat. And it's just, it's beautiful, it's perfect. And there's nothing wrong with that. Or you can just say he got a beer from the fridge, sat down, popped off the cap, and swallowed it down and really enjoyed the first swallow. And the difference is that the second one leaves your mind doing a lot more work. It's not giving you the direct play-by-play of each step of the thing, so you can still picture it, but you're probably not picturing it in as much detail. In other words, there's a lot more blank space to fill in. And when you're forced to fill in this sort of blank space in a prose sense, then it gives you more liberties in how you interpret things thematically, because they're not being presented as literally. Again, not everything is like this. This isn't necessarily like simple as all simplicity accomplishes this. This is just a possible byproduct of simplicity that I think doesn't get appreciated, because sometimes less can be more. It's what Hemingway described. I believe it was Hemingway. If it wasn't Hemingway, I'm going to sound like a complete dumbass. But it's the iceberg effect. You can imply an iceberg, 90% of the iceberg is unseen. So sometimes a few words of implication, a few words to set the scene, allow the reader more freedom to play with the text and interpret the text than necessarily being descriptive about every single thing. And that's what I mean by simplicity in writing offering more depth, because it allows the reader more freedom to focus on the themes being presented by not being as focused on the moment-to-moment thing, but also by encouraging them, getting them involved, getting us involved, I suppose I should say, in the scene itself, in what's going on, in much the same way that sometimes depriving answers from readers ends up creating more interpretation, more depth, more ways of looking at a story. kind of going a bit off track here, but it's why I prefer stories, like I mentioned in the Knausgaard, The Morning Star. It's why I prefer stories with a single protagonist and a very limited point of view, because I think when you're not omnisciently in every single character's head, then it leaves you a lot of freedom to play with what a character's motives were, whether or not they were, good or bad, what their intention was, and, consequently who they were as a person and how that impacts the overall story. So, again, lighter prose, more freedom to interpret characters, less information, more freedom to draw your own conclusions. Again, not saying that all simple prose is like this. A lot of authors just want to tell a story. Not saying all complex prose is necessarily, limited in what it can do. It can accomplish some amazingly deep stories. It is simply another way of looking at it, because the fact of the matter is, at the end of the day, complexity is not the same as depth. And I probably haven't convinced you because this is a rambling fucking mess, but I hope I've at least made you think about it.